Our final speaker is Robin Shulman. Robin is a freelance journalist based in New York City. She has reported on immigration, education, food, the environment, poverty, urban policy, and other issues in U.S. cities, the Middle East, and other parts of the world. She is most drawn to stories about the resourceful ways people solve and transcend problems. Her work has appeared on WNYC, New York Public Radio, and in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, and other publications. Please join me in welcoming Robin Shulman.
Thank you. I'm really glad to go after Alexandria's incredible video because in a way, my story shows one possible aftermath of the decision to leave. And my story is about this kind of astonishing program in Canada for regular people to sponsor Syrian refugees and bring a family of Syrians to live in Canada. And I decided to write this story over last winter. You probably saw the same kinds of headlines I was watching. The war in Syria has been devastating. More than about half of the people in the country have been displaced. Last fall, there were more than 4 million Syrian refugees registered with the UN. And this is the largest refugee crisis to touch Europe since World War II. Syrians were making headlines by washing up on the shores of Europe, and there were images we were seeing of people trekking across the continent, holding their children in their arms and passing through railway stations. And then there was this picture of Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian boy whose parents traveled with him on a rubber dinghy off Turkey, and the dinghy deflated and the little boy washed up on the shore. And the image of him, the child died face down in the sand, really touched me deeply. I have a little boy who's the exact same age as that child, dark-haired little, my son is dark-haired, and I looked at that boy and I saw my son. And I think people all over the world had that reaction. And there was this outpouring of sympathy for people uprooting their families and putting their children on life rafts and going off into the unknown. That was in September. Then in November, there were the attacks in Paris. And all of a sudden, Syrian refugees were making headlines because one of the attackers had a Syrian passport, which officials believe was fake, but which nonetheless sparked immediate outrage in the United States, and we felt the immediate impact here. Donald Trump said that Syrian refugees could be trying to enter the United States as part of a plot to commit terrorist acts here. 31 governors, including the governor of Illinois, signed a document saying that they didn't want Syrians to resettle in their state, even though it's not a state decision, it's a federal decision about whether we can admit refugees to the country. So suddenly we were blaming these people fleeing the violence for the violence. And in this atmosphere, I visited family in Toronto. So I went to Toronto in November, and my relatives there were talking about bringing Syrian refugees to live in their homes. My aunt and my cousin were sponsoring Syrian refugees. They were involved separately, and they had decided to become a part of what they call a group of 5. Any 5 people can get together and say, hey, I would like to bring a Syrian family here. And they can go through an incredible amount of paperwork. They fill out 60 pages of documents. They make a detailed settlement plan saying, here's who will pick this family up from the airport. Here's who will take them to register for school. Here's how we propose to help them adjust emotionally and be involved in their lives socially. And we pledged to finance them for 1 year and provide financial support for 1 year. So for a family of 4, that's around $27,000. So some of my family members were really excited about their involvement in this. And to me, coming from the conversation and atmosphere in the United States, I was really blown away. It sounded like a radical idea that regular people could just up and decide to bring in refugees to live in their city. But it also seemed like such a simple idea, and one that could immediately involve so many people who look at these headlines and feel frustrated at inaction and frustrated at the kind of conversation out there, but totally unable to take action, totally unable to do anything to make any difference. So suddenly this program allows these people to engage. And I didn't think you could do that in the United States, but I wasn't actually very sure. And I came back and looked it up. You can't do that in the United States. In the United States, the government is the only party that can sponsor refugees, and there are 9 resettlement organizations that are contracted by the government to resettle them. So there are caseworkers, and there are programs, and there are you know, stipulations about how many pieces of cutlery each family needs to have in their kitchen when they arrive, and what kind of programs they need to be offered as they resettle. But there's not this kind of spontaneous possibility for regular people to be the initiators and to have the real responsibility that they do in Canada. And you know, I started thinking more about it, and I was especially interested because another cousin of mine in Canada was talking about making a basement apartment in her home available to a Syrian family. And I was really interested in this because she's an engineer. And she's a nuclear engineer. She has no background in immigration or social welfare. She had no prior history working with Syrians. But I was thinking, if she is involved, this must be really widespread. And I started to realize that this could be a really interesting story if regular people like her in Canada are starting to feel themselves capable of making that kind of change. So I started to look into it. I did a Nexus search. I looked into articles in the Canadian press about what was happening there. And sure enough, there were stories about an Eskimo grandmother who was raising money to bring Syrians to her community. There were parents' associations at schools who were sponsoring Syrian families as a program through their kids' school. And I realized that this was a story that I really wanted to do. My background is partially in the Middle East. I've spent years reporting on the Middle East. I speak some Arabic. And so this was a story I really wanted to be involved in because it seemed to me to be something that ran counter to the stories that we were seeing around us. And it was especially interesting because I came to realize that there were some groups in the United States that were pressing for Obama to take executive action to create a similar program here. And in the past, under Reagan, there had been opportunity for private groups to sponsor refugees. And it's interesting because Reagan wanted to privatize many functions of government, and this was one aspect of his program, of the things that he privatized. But the program brought many Cubans and Soviet Jews to the United States through private groups. But then it faded out under Clinton. So now there were groups calling for a similar program to engage citizens in a new kind of way. And so that was just kind of simmering because since the attacks on Paris, it hadn't really gained much traction. So I really wanted to tell you about how I came to this story because I think it's important for you as teachers that I went to my community, I talked to my family, and I saw something happening that it wasn't being reported in the press that I saw as a story. And that's something that your students can do and that you can do in every community. There are stories where local and global events touch people's lives that the mainstream media may not be reporting on at all, or maybe reporting on insufficiently, or maybe not really getting at the heart of the issue and how it's impacting people around you. And this is a way that your students can think about what's happening in their lives and really bring that to conversation and figure out how to shape that into a story that would be meaningful, maybe beyond just your classroom. So I think there are 2 important things to know as you're thinking about this story. One is that most Syrian refugees are in the countries around Syria. In Lebanon, which is a really politically and economically fragile country neighboring Syria, there are 1 million Syrian refugees. There are only 4 million Lebanese. So it has impacted Lebanon enormously. In Jordan, Turkey, and Egypt and Iraq, that's where the majority of Syrian refugees are. So even though this is a crisis that has impacted Europe, and we're seeing these images on the news, the greatest impact is on Syria and neighboring countries itself. And then the other thing to think about is that in North America, we have an entirely different process for bringing refugees than what we're seeing in the news in Europe. In the United States, we are distant from the Syrian conflict. We don't have any land or water borders. And so there are not people flooding our borders trying to get in from Syria. The people who apply to come to the United States or come to North America from Syria, from the Middle East, from Afghanistan, are going through an extended process that for Syrians often takes 2 years. And they go through extensive background checks, security checks, health checks. It's a really prolonged process, and the US officials can reject them at any stage for any reason. So if there's any doubt at all about their status, about their security risk, they're out. The list is very long of people who want to come here, and they don't even need to give a reason. So if there's any question about a person and a family's risk to this country, they're not going to land here. So I started making phone calls for my reporting. I wanted to do the story in Toronto, and I started making phone calls to figure out what shape it would take. And I made a lot of calls, and I wanted to talk to as many people surrounding Syrian refugees in Toronto as I could before I actually traveled there to figure out who I would focus on and what I actually wanted to write about. And I had, over the phone in my apartment in New York, talking to these people in Toronto, some of the most emotional interviews I've ever had, even though I've spent time reporting on wars and talking about incredibly emotional things. I talked with a Holocaust survivor who was sponsoring a Syrian family because of her own experience. She came to Canada as a child. I think she was a baby of 2 years old. And her parents came to Canada, and they were given $10 and a salami and told good luck. And so she was working with her synagogue, actually, to sponsor a Syrian family. And I was especially moved by that because obviously sponsoring Syrians is no natural move for a synagogue, but it turned out that synagogues in the big cities in Canada were really rallying around bringing Syrians. And not just radical synagogues on the fringes, but conservative and more traditional synagogues. People were really getting behind this and telling their congregations, you know, remember what happened to the Jews in this period, and this is what we have to act. I spoke with several Vietnamese refugees who had come to Canada and had themselves been privately sponsored in the same way. Because the genesis of the Canadian program happened in the time of the boat people. And there was so much public outrage about the lack of humanitarian response that people really pressed the government to take action and ended up creating this private sponsorship program so that regular people could be involved. So I talked to people who had benefited from that and now were organizing the Vietnamese community to help Syrians. And then I just talked with people who were members of a book club, and the book club brought baklava over one night and said, hey, let's do something about the Middle East, let's sponsor a Syrian family, and they did. And a dog walking group, and they were walking their dogs in the park together one night and said, hey, over the dog run, why don't we bring a Syrian family? And they did. So it really seemed, it was something so incredibly moving that here were people, many of them had no experience with this issue and no real sense of how to talk to a Syrian family or what their needs might be, but they were really thinking so creatively about what they might do, and thinking of locating them in an area near a mosque, or thinking of how they could, looking up recipes to make a halal meal so that they could greet them with traditional Syrian meal when they first arrived in Canada. And there was this excitement among all the people I was speaking with that was really palpable, and people were really trying to imagine beyond their own lives to greet and welcome a family whose experience was so entirely different from their own. Then I went to Toronto and I met a Syrian family, and I will show you a few pictures of them. So I met this family, Amira and Ragda, and they had 2 daughters, Reina, who was 6, and Nagam, who was 5. And they had just arrived in Toronto 10 days before I met them. And I met them on the eve of their first day of school. And for them, this was a big deal because the 2 girls were only 5 and 6 years old. They'd never been to school. They had basically lived their entire lives through war. So they had been internally displaced within Syria. They had left their home. First, they're from the city of Homs in Syria, which is known as the birthplace of the revolution. It was where the first demonstrations were sparked. But it was also a place that soon after was besieged. And so the girls lived months of their lives under siege, like not having enough food, trying to find enough food, staying inside the house for essentially most of the time for years. And then there was bombing all around them. And eventually the family fled to another city, another city in Syria. And they lived there for a period until the building they were living on was struck by an airstrike while they were inside. And they were safe, but they left that city. And then they fled to Lebanon, where they couldn't get Amir couldn't get consistent work permits, and so was working illegally, and several times was picked up and thrown into jail, even though the family had refugee status with the UN and was awaiting permanent placement in Canada. So it was really one nightmare after another, and the children had never been to school, and Amir and Rugda were about to start English classes for the first time, and actually Amir and Rugda had left school in 7th and 9th grades, so they didn't have much education either, and it had been a long time since they had been in a classroom. And they really realized that learning English and attending these English classes would be their key to their new life. So it was a big day for them, and they were nervous. And so this is the morning of them getting ready for school. It also happened to be a blizzard. It was February, and they had never experienced snow blizzard like this. They were, Naram was putting on her snowsuit for the first time. Her gloves are enormous. All of this had been donated by their sponsor group, their snow outfits, everything they were wearing. And they didn't really know how to walk in these big winter boots, so they were kind of like, the girls were like tripping along because they had never worn big snow boots before. And so this is them walking home from school after their first day, both on the way to school and the way home from school. Amir had Arabic language Google Maps on his phone, and he was navigating his family to school, which was, you know, a neighborhood school about 10 blocks from their house, using Arabic language Google Maps. And then that's how they were getting back home again at the end of the day. And as I spent more time with this family, I started to realize how incredibly resourceful Amir is and Rugda is. They had been through a lot, but he was just like, Canada is going to be a cinch. You know, after everything I've endured, you know, I can load this Google Maps onto my phone. I can get my family around. I can figure out the lay of the land. I'm not worried about this. This was part of what so impressed me in the early time I met them. And then I was also struck by how full of fun and joyful they were. This was their very first day of school. On the way home from school, Rugda saw this snowman across the street in the park as we were walking home, and like she dropped everything and ran over across the street and wanted to hug the snowman. She'd never seen a big snowman like that. And then everybody got down in the snow and was making snow angels. So Amir and Rugda and the girls were all making snow angels. And it really struck me how open they were. And you know, part of this is you can really tell that Amir and Rugda are a strong couple, very much connected with each other and really making decisions in tandem to each other, with each other, and really excited about this new life. But they told me repeatedly, I mean, I think you talked, Alexandria, about having, or in your video, somebody said I would have to be reborn. But that's the word they used repeatedly, like, I feel reborn here. This is a new life. And there was all of the excitement and all of the terror of that new life. And part of the confidence they were developing as I watched was from this group of Canadians all around them that were showing such generosity to them. Rugda told me, it makes me believe in humanity again. After all we've been through, the war and the bombing and the destruction of our way of life in our city, like to have these people out of nowhere be so generous to strangers restores my faith in humanity. And so I just saw this in its earliest days, but as I've watched them over time, I really believe that that is that sense of a community of people offering help is what allows them to be joyful and open and to build a new life this way. This is the girls' bedroom. The Canadian sponsors had put the house together really on the eve before they arrived. They came on a Friday and Thursday night. There was a pizza party in this apartment where people were bringing in the beds and the furniture, and the toys. Somebody said, oh, they don't have enough toys, and went on a run to Walmart to buy more toys to stock the bedroom. You can see it's kind of a work in progress. On the floor is a Canadian Red Cross blanket the girls were using as a carpet. But for the girls, they had never had a room of their own. The last place they lived was an apartment in Lebanon that they were sharing with 11 family members in 3 bedrooms. And they were thrilled, and they want to live. They said they want to live in this place forever. So these are the girls with 2 teddy bears. The teddy bears are one of the only things they brought with them from their life in Syria when they left for Lebanon. The teddy bears were one of the only things the girls have. And actually, they had another set of 2 little red teddy bears from Syria, and they gave me one. And this is the family, Amir and Rugda, and the 2 girls with their Canadian sponsors. So you can see Ashley and Ali are the couple, and their daughter Aria, and then Ashley's sister Mallory. And they are the core of the sponsor group that brought them to Canada. And I talked a lot with Ashley about her idea to do it, because it was her idea to sponsor this family. And she said that back in the fall, she had come up with the idea. It was in the news, and it really started to become part of the Canadian conversation after the death of Alan Kurdi, the little boy. It had turned out that Alan Kurdi's extended family had been attempting to come to Canada through a private sponsorship because they had family there. But the then Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who was a conservative, had put a halt on private sponsorships, essentially. He'd created a lot of bureaucracy around private sponsorships, so they weren't going through. And in that situation, the family decided to make the trip over water. The other part of the family decided to make that trip over water. So this really struck Canadians. They felt if our private sponsorship program had been working, maybe that boy wouldn't have died. And it happened that it was just launching into an election campaign, and suddenly Syrian refugees and private sponsorship became a key part of the election campaign in Canada. And the candidates for Prime Minister were kind of jumping over each other, trying to compete to promise who could bring more Syrian refugees to Canada. So it was the opposite effect that it had in our election campaign. The Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came to office with promises to bring more Syrians, but also to work with private sponsors. He asked for help from the private sponsors because he promised to bring 25,000 Syrians by the end of 2015. He later extended that to March 2016, but he was planning to work with private sponsors to make that happen. So people like Ashley, who came up with this idea, really had the feeling that this was a national project. And this was something that there would be support for on all kinds of levels. And her colleagues at work were asking her, what's happening with the Syrian family? And she actually, so initially she had gotten this idea that she wanted to do it, but her daughter then was 18 months old. She'd just gone back to work. She was thinking, you know what, it's just not a good time for our family. And then she found out that the person who cleans her house, her housekeeper, her name is Cathy McElroy, who's 62 years old, herself had been sponsoring a Syrian family. And she had raised $20,000, or helped raise $20,000 selling chicken on a bun at a charity event to bring a Syrian family to Toronto. So at that point, Ashley said, all right, if our housekeeper can do it, we can do it too. And they decided to raise funds to bring the family, and in fact was able to raise funds to bring the family in about 3 weeks, and ended up with tens of thousands of dollars more than they needed. And this is a picture of Rugda studying English at the end of her day at school. You can see by the expression on her face, she's totally focused and determined. And they just really wanted to spend all their spare time learning the language and figuring out their place in this new world. And that was really impressive. This is Reina greeting Nahum at the end of the school day. The girls are in the same school, but there's no ESL for the kindergarten. So Nahum has been kind of thrown into a classroom where she has to speak English all the time, whereas Reina is in grade 1 and has ESL, and so learned English basically from day one. She was already speaking a few words of English at the end of her first day of school. But at the end of the day of school, their girls are so excited to see each other. They save each other little things, little treats they get during the day. Like the first day, I think they had yogurt. They were like, it's like ice cream, but it's not cold. And so they really hadn't spent any time apart from each other in their lives. And so the day at school, I think, was a little scary and hard for them to be away from each other, and they were really excited to see each other at the end of the day. And there's a picture of Reina in her classroom at school. So really, the thing that really struck me about this was just how many people are invested in this family's success. There are 20 people who are volunteering to spend time with them and visit them, provide basic things for them, help them with doctor's appointments, do errands for them. And then there are another 80 people who are donors who are getting regular reports on the status of how this family is doing. So I really think it created this extended network of support that is astonishing, and kind of what a family needs if they're going to be reborn again in another place with no language and no contact. And I also think that that kind of setup creates a ripple effect where when your colleagues are asking you, how is the Syrian family you're sponsoring? You know, do the girls need shoes? Like, I have extra toys. I know somebody who's a doctor who speaks Arabic. When you have this growing network of people, there are more and more people entering the conversation who have no political interest in the issue, who have no prior knowledge of it, but all of a sudden have a personal connection. And that's what these people, the sponsors, were reporting to me from their own lives. Like their mothers and their aunts and their colleagues and their neighbors were coming in and keeping tabs on the status of this family and trying to help out however they could. So suddenly whatever fear people may have had about Syrian refugees in the abstract was made concrete in helping the lives of these people, helping them set up new lives. And it really transformed the way they viewed this issue. And I was really struck by how different the conversation was here. And you know, part of the reason for that is that so few Syrians have come here. There have been only slightly more than 2,000 Syrians come this year out of a promised 10,000, but it's less than half the number that went to Canada, and our population is 10 times as large. So people aren't meeting Syrians, and so for most people, the issue is still an abstract one, and really it's one where politicians have played on our fears. And so I wonder if both the presence of Syrians and the ability to take action itself could change the dialogue here. And I started wondering if, you know, we have these people promising terror and violence if Syrians come, but we don't really have a countervailing force. We don't have Syrians here presenting normal family lives and their hopes and aspirations for their kids. So perhaps the presence of Syrians and our ability to act itself could change the dialogue surrounding Syrian refugees. So for me, this was one of the most amazing stories I've ever reported. I've reported in war zones. I've reported at these incredibly intimate moments of people's lives where they've lost a family member, where political issues in some way are entering their lives and wreaking havoc on their lives during political campaigns, during siege, when somebody has been kidnapped or killed. But I have never been present at a moment when it seems like a whole society is kind of rallying in an act of kindness, and it seemed like a national movement to take care of people in need, and to me it was astonishingly moving, and especially in such a global climate that's been so hostile towards this kind of action. It seemed especially remarkable and really highlighted the way that people can have an unexpected and profound impact on other people's lives. So for the update, Amir and Ragda and their daughters are doing fantastically well. They're basically speaking English. I talked to them the other day on the phone, and we had a conversation entirely in English, and they've only been here since February. And the girls speak Reina speaks even better English than her parents. Naam, who was stuck in the kindergarten class with no ESL, is not doing as well, but she's still speaking some. Amir got a job as a butcher. That's his profession. And he just went over to the Arabic grocery store, which is in a massive store in Toronto, and asked if he could fill out an application, and he got a job. And so he got a bike, and he bikes over to work every day. And he's also still taking English along with Ragda. So they're in English class, I think, till 3, and then he's working evenings at the grocery store. And he's speaking English on the job and really just doing great. Ragda, from the start, was talking about how different her life felt in Toronto and how full of possibility it felt. She said, people here want to know what I think, and it feels so different from my life in Syria, where people don't really want to know what women think. And she really felt that she felt like, I can just go out on the street and nobody's harassing me here, I'm invisible. Where she'd been living in Lebanon, she was constantly afraid because as a Syrian and as a woman, she was constantly harassed. And she has all kinds of new ambitions she never thought she would realize. She wants to finish high school, and she wants to work in a profession where she wouldn't have had those opportunities before, which is also just a reflection of the social class she came from, because many Syrian women have a lot of education and work as professionals, but in Ragda's world, which was a more traditional rural world, that wasn't common. So I am going to visit them later this week when I go to Canada to visit family and check in with them. And also Ashley and Ali and Mallory, their sponsors, have been, I think, profoundly impacted by this experience too. They continue to see them regularly, and they view them now more as friends than as somebody in need of help. They're hoping that they get to this stage where they can just celebrate family parties together and spend time together with their families. But they had so much money left over from the sponsorship, and their experience of this sponsorship was so easy that they decided to sponsor more people. So they're sponsoring I believe two of Amir's brothers and their families. One of the applications is already in the works. This is for Amir's brother, who was paralyzed in a bombing in Syria and has been in Lebanon alone without family members since Amir left. That sponsorship application is already in the works. And then I think another family member in Jordan with his wife and children, I believe, they're hoping to put that application into, because for them, they were amazed at how easy it was to have such a profound impact. So they want to do it more. And the story itself may have some impact. Actually, in advance of my writing this story, when I was reporting it, I talked with the policy people at resettlement agencies in the United States about whether they supported private sponsorship in the US. And several of them told me they didn't think it would work here. There were so many barriers to it. The political climate was so hostile to it that they didn't think it was the right time to bring it up. But after the story came out, they said, you know, I read that story, and several of them told me that they found it inspiring and that they felt that they should revisit the issue. And actually today, as we speak, the directors of resettlement organizations, the 9 resettlement groups in the country, are meeting today to talk about, among other things, whether to support private sponsorship. So they kind of said, one of them told me, we can't just go on business as usual, we need to do something about this. So we'll see what happens, but it's been an amazing story for me to be involved with, and I was so grateful to the Pulitzer Center for making that possible. You could, yeah. The main group that's been involved in pressing for this in the U.S. has been a group called the Niskanen Center, which is a libertarian group. But the settlement organizations, you could find out. I mean, I could try and find out what settlement organizations are active in Chicago. You could contact those organizations and tell them that you support this initiative, or you could contact your representatives in Congress and tell them that this is important to you.
I read the story, and I actually heard from friends in the U.S. that they were trying to work with Canadian families to help them indirectly, because we can't do it as we help the Canadians are doing it.
That has been really interesting too, because obviously Facebook has no borders. So a lot of the fundraising takes place online, Indiegogo or Facebook, all kinds of sites. And so many people have been sending money or other support from the United States. And in fact, I even met one person who is Canadian, living in California, married to a California woman. And he initiated it. He called his dad in Toronto and it's like, hey, Dad, I want you to privately sponsor this Syrian family. I can't do it because I'm in the US, but I'm raising all the money on my Facebook site. I'll send it to you, and you just need to bring the family. And then ended up in trouble with PayPal because they wouldn't do a money transfer for a group that had Syrian in the title. It was like Syrians helping Syrian families or something was the name of the PayPal account. And because it had Syrians in the title, they froze the money on grounds of suspicion of terrorism for cross-border transfer. But anyway, yes, there are Americans involved, but there are obviously complications from across the border.
Yeah. What is the obligation as far as money for us? How long do you sponsor? How long do you provide money?
Well, usually the standard way is for 1 year. There are actually different models of how you can do it in Canada. So the most free, the model that provides the most freedom to the sponsors is the group of 5 model, where any 5 people can get together and do it. But they have the greatest responsibility. So they have to commit and sign legal documents that they will sponsor this family for 1 year. And actually the way that Amir and Rugda came was not that way. And they worked through an organization that took the legal responsibility. So there was a bit less responsibility on the family. So there are different ways.